My father once told me about a tradition in his village called a night with the dead. Back then, the customs of the region highly respected men and looked down on women. Women had a low status. After getting married, they often had to do heavy labor. If they didn't perform well, it was common for husbands to beat and torture them. No one had the right to interfere in another family's affairs. And of course, the woman's family didn't want that to happen to their daughter. Sometimes a woman's death was recorded by the police as a suicide, and the husband's family would face no punishment. As a result, a custom emerged in the village where, during the first 7 days after the wife died, the village youth would tie up the husband and lock him in a room with his wife's corpse for a night. If nothing happened by the next morning, it meant that the death had nothing to do with the husband, or that the deceased had forgiven him. The purpose of this custom was for the husband to endure some form of punishment to appease the wife's family. When my father was young, the sister of one of his friends got married, and a month after moving in with her husband's family, she hanged herself. With the help of some brothers, they went to the husband's village and tied him up to carry out this tradition. My father said that the husband was very adamant and stubborn, insisting that he treated his wife well, and that she had psychological issues, which led to her suicide. When the husband realized he was going to be locked in a room with his wife's corpse, panicked and begged to be released. They left him with the corpse, and if he was fine by morning, he would be freed. Before leaving, they turned off the lights and locked the door, plunging the room into darkness, with only the moonlight shining through the window. The room was completely dark, leaving only the husband and the hanging corpse. His eyes were glued to the body, and fear consumed him. In such a situation, no matter how brave the husband was, he couldn't endure it. He felt terrified, his heart pounding in his chest, holding his breath and hoping for dawn. The wife's body was covered with a white cloth, motionless. But that's when the terrifying events began. He stared at the corpse, trembling with fear. Suddenly, there was a noise from the wife's body, and the corpse in the room started to chuckle, followed by a chilling laugh. The corpse shook violently, and the white cloth tightened. Corpse slowly stood up. After a moment, the corpse stood upright, its hair covering its face, and began moving toward the husband. The corpse's feet left the ground and began to hover, as if it were hanging in midair. No matter how desperately the husband pleaded, corpse continued to approach. A pair of white teeth emerged, and a pale face appeared. Corpse's bloodshot eyes stared at the husband with what seemed like resentment. Suddenly, something even more horrifying happened. The wife's corpse's neck began to stretch. The neck elongated nearly 2 meters like a snake, reaching toward the husband. Pale, oversized face lowered straight down in front of the husband. He froze, unable to move due to the overwhelming fear. The husband was drenched in sweat, unable to utter a word, just staring at the corpse, awaiting the dreadful fate that awaited him. The wife's corpse said nothing, just growled and glared at him with an increasingly angry and ferocious expression. Suddenly, the wife opened her mouth wide and lunged at the husband. The scene was terrifying. Out of nowhere, a scream erupted, and the husband was so scared that he wet himself, begging his wife not to come any closer. The people who had locked him in were secretly peeking inside, as if they were watching a horror movie, with the husband as the main character. They didn't leave. They had set everything up to teach the husband a lesson and force him to confess what he had done that led to his wife's death. My father's friend was smugly watching the husband tremble inside. Suddenly, he froze when he heard a familiar voice from the group behind him. He turned around in shock and confusion. "Oh my God, aren't you the one pretending to be the ghost inside?" My father's friend thought that his cousin was pretending to be the ghost inside, but why was he standing outside with them? Seeing his cousin still standing outside, they were all surprised, but the cousin was even more surprised, taking off his wig and saying that the plan was to start scaring the husband half an hour later. But it was still too early. They were all puzzled and felt something was wrong. So who was pretending to be the ghost and scaring the husband inside? Cousin scratched his head and said, "How strange. Do you think it's a real ghost?" At this point, They looked at each other, realizing that if the cousin was still outside, then what they were witnessing inside was the real ghost of the wife. They were all terrified, not knowing what to do. Their bodies went cold, too afraid to move. Slowly, they looked back inside, and the sight was horrifying. The ghost's elongated neck was threatening the man inside. Looking closer, they saw that it was indeed a real ghost, and their fear reached its peak. They screamed and ran out of the yard. The next morning, they finally dared to return to check. The wife's corpse was still inside, and the husband had fainted from fear. After that, the man went mad, crying, laughing, and begging for forgiveness from his wife.